Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second keynote for the day. I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon, or this morning, or this evening, depending where you are in and in which time zone. Wherever you are, you're very warmly welcome. My name is Myria Georgiou, and I'm a professor in media and communications at the LSE. And it is a delight and an honor to introduce Professor Engin Isin to you. Professor Isin is based at the International Politics Department at Queen Mary, University of London. His research and teaching focuses on doing international politics. His work has been extremely influential across the social sciences, particularly in thinking and analyzing the ways in which people constitute themselves as actors or subjects of politics through performances, movements, and struggles. Professor Isin has undertaken a lot of research across regions and periods. So he has undertaken historical and political sociological studies across the British imperial and colonial practices in Africa, America, Asia, Middle East, and the Ottoman imperial and colonial practices in Europe and in the Middle East and North Africa. He has also studied French colonialism in Quebec, Haiti, and Algeria, as well as he has had conducted historical sociology of citizenship in Canada and in Europe. The driving force in all of this fascinating work produced by Professor Isin has been the tension between imperial, colonial, or national designs for conduct of people, and how people subvert these designs by performative acts and reinvent political subjectivities. This is the tension he often explores in how people constitute themselves as international and today digital citizens. He's a prolific writer, and he's the author and editor of 6 books, including Being Political, Genealogies of Citizenship, and Being Digital Citizens with Evelyn Rupert. Continuing along this line of work, his talk today is titled Digital Citizens Yet to Come. Professor Isin will take the floor now, the virtual floor, and then he will take questions from the audience at the end. In the meantime, you're welcome to add your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Professor Isin, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Myria, for that introduction. It's much appreciated. Thanks very much for your attention to detail, as well as broad overview of the work I've done on citizenship in general, but specifically digital citizens. Today, I want to talk about digital citizenship, digital citizens as yet to come. What I want to do is to introduce some basic concepts before we actually begin to understand what I mean by digital citizens yet to come. For that to happen, we are going to do a broad overview of performativity and acts, as well as drawing on earlier work that I have done. In the last 2-3 years, I have been working on specifically data politics or data activism. One work that I'm going to draw upon today is the work that I've done with Evelyn Rupert in 3 different publications. One is on data empires, the other one on being digital citizens, and more recently, the birth of sensory power. Together with these 3 works, what we have tried to do is to give an account of the paradoxical relationship that emerged on the internet concerning data politics and the tension between, on the one hand, data being used for accumulation of subjects and accumulation of subjectivities, surveillance practices, and even more sinister, certain conventions by which to modify and change behavior of people on the internet. This is done mostly via closed platforms, Apple, Google, Twitter, Facebook. We have heard about these, but we conceptualize them as data empires. That has parallels with East India, Dutch East India Company, British East India Company, French East India Company. These companies that emerged during empire building and colonization, where various private functions were outsourced as public functions, and they began acting like states. That's work on data politics that I draw upon understanding digital citizens yet to come. And then being digital citizens, what we did, a second edition we have published, and where we added a chapter with that title, Digital Citizens Yet to Come, and took into consideration of the enormous amount of work that's been done in the last 5 years on data activism. And the third publication, what we have done there is The Birth of Sensory Power. We took a step back from the changes that are taking place in data politics and data activism, place them in historical context, but identify what might be new in the last 20 years. We call this sensory power and articulated in relation to other forms of power. I have also published two pieces in the past couple of years. Well, one of them is coming, has just come out in German on citizenship, where I have pushed the boundaries of defining citizenship in performative ways. It's a short piece, but it takes the idea of resignifying citizenship seriously, and then with decolonial, post-colonial inflection, gives an example of how citizenship might be redefined if it needs to be signified and resignified. And then another work, this one is published in French, is an expanded version of an original article in English, Peuple Mobile, mobile people, how people on the move can be conceptualized as people, as opposed to for being considered qualified to be a people at all, that certain people have to be sedentary. So the mobile people is itself a contradiction in terms, and I have thought through what it might look like. What I'm going to do is to elaborate a little bit more on the digital citizens yet to come and citizens yet to come ideas. And then in 4 parts, I'm going to focus on first, performativity and acts, why it is absolutely essential to think through performativity and acts to understand digital politics, data politics today. I'm going to focus in on Austin for various reasons that I'm going to explain. And in part 3, then I'm going to step back and look at digital acts in general. And then in part 4, I'm going to look at transversal movements as part of critical migration studies. And the conclusion, I want to come back to the notion of digital citizens yet to come. Now, 2 concepts are really important in theorizing peoples on the move, that is non-sedentary, but not necessarily geographic mobility. People move, especially in the digital sphere, in various ways, in other ways than geographic mobility or physical mobility. So people on the move does not necessarily refer to merely what we consider as migrants, but all sorts of movements that implicate those who might be mobile geographically, but also they may not. Citizens yet to come is an important aspect of this. When I use the term citizenship and citizens, I always think of it as performatively, not that which is already instituted and inscribed in conventions, particularly nation state and nationality conventions, but always perform with a potentiality. When people do things to assemble together various rights and make claims to enact themselves as political subjects against oppression, against injustices, against suppression of certain activities, certain ways of being and identities, they are not necessarily performing these acts as citizens, but citizens yet to come. That is, they're inscribing and enacting certain ways of performing this particular identity, particular subject position, and pointing toward its possibilities. What can one do? What can should do with them, as it were, as collectives? So, citizens yet to come is always part of thinking about citizenship in the first place, not citizenship as inscribed already in law, in theory, and in practice. And digital citizens yet to come is not any different. The ways in which I want to think about digital citizens yet to come, how it might take shape, how it might perform itself, as not something that one describes, one finds already developed, but one actually reveals, unconceals in practices, in performatives, through which people are articulating themselves against injustices. They are remaking themselves. They are constituting themselves political subjects, although they may not be authorized to do so by convention. So it's important to make this distinction when I use particularly the concept of citizenship. It's not in the way in which is already understood, but in the way in which performed differently and in potentiality. That's where its promise lies. That's where its significance lies. So it's not so much as describing something that already exists, but signifying something that is coming into being. But it turns out that in fact, describing something already exists is already an impossible task, as I will explain in performativity and acts. So let's focus on that notion of the impossibility of description. What does that mean when we consider performativity and acts? Now, I'm going to quickly um, provide an overview to you. Origins and uses of performativity. One of the things that I want to impress on you today is that performativity is a subversive and subaltern, has a genealogy. That it has come about as a reaction to an affirmation of a different way of understanding and performing science and production of knowledge. It begins with phenomenology. Edmund Husserl, Rainer Heidegger, and Jean-Paul Sartre, their understanding of the relationship between an object and a subject, and their understanding of the tension between description and performance. Ordinary language philosophy with Ludwig Wittgenstein and Austin, this became formulated even more clearly analytically. Impossibility of description in language of things that are already said to exist. But in fact, every time we do things with words, every time we actually engage in a speech act, we are bringing things into this world. We are being creative. We are creating things, situations, and scenes when we use language. And in ordinary life sociology, this has been taken in the direction, for example, with Erving Goffman, presentation of self in everyday life, how people create themselves, remake themselves in everyday life by performing themselves. And we cannot understand these performatively brought about identities or subject positions unless we empirically investigate how people do these things in public when they present themselves. And Garfinkel with ethnomethodology and Bloomer also with a specific focus on acts reminded us of the importance of thinking about performativity. And then there's a theater and performance studies Bertolt Brecht is absolutely essential in understanding his insistence that what takes place on the stage is not artificial. It's not performance in the sense that it is put on, but it is real. And his um, his philosophy of theater to interrupt audience and engage them in it, participate, pull them into the very staging of the act that he presented, that act of blurring the boundary between the spectator and the spectacle was absolutely essential. And in performance studies, that has been worked up. And then in deconstruction and discourse, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault were very much influenced by Austin, the former explicitly, the latter implicitly. I cannot go into those differences here. But origins of performativity, it has a subaltern and subversive genealogy in understanding science, knowledge, and power. And we have to underline the significance of that. The use of performativity and where it ended up in its lineage is a testimony to what I have just said. It's subaltern and subversive genealogy, queer feminism, black feminism, in post-structuralism, in decolonial and post-colonial studies, science and technology studies, critical race theory. Performative has been taken up, taken in different directions, reassembled, reshaped, as performativity itself would insist that that would be the only way to work with performativity, in taking it in different directions and making it respond to particular situations and produce and create different kinds of knowledges, what Foucault called subjugated knowledges, understanding subjugated knowledges and their principles of subjugation. So the uses of performativity is a testimony to what I called the subversive and subaltern origins of genealogy and performativity. Now, here what you see is a very complex, layered one way of visualizing this particular subaltern and subversive genealogy. What I do here is to divide it into four main origins in philosophy, in dramaturgy, psychology, and sociology, trace the lines and make the connections, and then identify various elements of it. So, for example, dramaturgy from Brecht, also you can trace it to situationism, Guy Debord. In psychology, it's not only Freud, but Lacan's notion of acts and Guattari's working of transversal, transversality versus transference as an act of understanding of the self in the presence of the other. In sociology, Goffman's and Bloom's workings move into Tilly and Tilly's understanding of contentious performances. Um, to me, one of the most significant lineages in this subversive and subaltern genealogy is also in philosophy the tension between pragmatism, language, and phenomenology that works its way into essentially Austin, and from Austin, Derrida and Butler. The key point I want to make here, of course, I am bringing before you an enormous tradition, what I called a subculture, subaltern, subterranean, if not subversive tradition in, um, dare I say, European tradition of science, production of knowledge, but going very much against the grain of that tradition, teasing out its possibilities, taking it into different directions, and insisting a different understanding of knowledge and how we as knowledge producers are related to it. So when we use performativity and understanding of digital acts or acts of um, political engagement today, we do have the weight of this tradition, which I call a subversive and subaltern genealogy. That has to be understood absolutely for us to grasp the significance of understanding digital maps the way in which we're understanding today. Now, I want to just move to Austin here, not because I'm going to given a comprehensive overview of Austin, but number of principles that are really significant, which I consider as a radical intervention on the part of Austin on the relationship between knowledge and power. He is not necessarily understood that way, but it is definitely possible to interpret Austin when he says doing things with words, and the sharp distinction he brings between um, description and um, performance or performatives or utterance in the way in which relationship of between knowledge and power can be understood, and the subversive way in which also he considers the impossibility of how science presents itself as science of description that can be falsified and verified. So in Austin, number of things are happening that is deeply critical, that are deeply critical, so much so that I would call Austin a radical critic of modernity. When he understands doing things with words, he is developing a critique of the dominant view that sees a speech act as a description. By the way, for Austin, speech act, and particularly doing things with words, does not necessarily mean only verbal speech. Gestures, actions, movement, corporal movement, bodily movements, rubbing against other physical elements, material engagement, these are also speech acts in the sense that they intervene in the world in which they speak, the world of which they speak, the world by which they speak. This is important to understand. So when we say speech acts, it is not just only verbal utterance of things, although words are significant, but words are not only conveyed through, um, um, I should say, meaning is not only conveyed through words, but also via other things. Meaning is conveyed in various forms, and Austin is aware of that. And he sees descriptive speech as constatives. This is one of the special languages that he uses. They're constative in the sense that they claim to describe a situation. They are statements in the sense that they can describe something outside of their own operation, and they can be verified and or falsified. Falsified. Now, on one level, Austin is making a case in language, and it's utterly banal in some ways. But when you think differently, when you're interpreting Austin, that when you say describing something outside of their own operation, just think about science or social science. Their claims to verification and falsification predicated on the objects which they describe having existed outside their own operation. Austin is deeply, radically critical about that assumption that science might make. But he's not necessarily singling out science here precisely because he does not necessarily see a fundamental ontological difference between utterance of ordinary people and scientists. In fact, all utterances are utterances, and they need to be understood through the objects by which and in which they are implicated. So, develop this idea, what Austin does, that he moves from statement to utterance in the sense that if a constative, what we call constative, is a speech act, a statement that signifies a meaning about something, an utterance either warns about something or urges someone to do something. This warning and urging is a very significant aspect of, affective aspect of speech, in the sense that when I speak, I am trying to bring about a consequence as a consequence of me uttering this uttering this um, act, this speech. I am aiming to bring about something. It's warning, urge, but also it can use other affective and non-affective utterances to bring about. So utterance accomplishes an act by its force rather than signifying a meaning. Now, this is fundamental. I cannot really emphasize enough the significance that it has made, a significant impact that it has made on me in understanding the difference, ontological difference of utterances or speech acts by accomplishing an act by its force, urging, warning, is a fundamental aspect of not only scientific speech but also non-scientific speech, rather than signifying merely a meaning. That is, this meanings that this is as this meaning. This is the meaning that we attribute to this particular act. These descriptions themselves are never pure descriptions. At the moment of utterance, actually appearing to signify a meaning, one brings out a performative force to bear on them. When in the media, for example, a dignified politician comes into view and says, "This is an act of terror." In what sense this is a description, and in what sense it's a performative force, warning and urging people to participate in understanding a particular action in a particular way, an act of terror, assembling together as interpolating subjects to think through this action, agreeing with it, this action is in fact a terror, therefore there must be consequences. So the act of defining something, meaning, has its own force. Austin sort of groups these things in of, in, and by saying something, we produce something. He says that there are many verbs in English language that can be classified according to these effects of meaning or force. But Austin uses three connectives to classify speech acts: of, in, and by doing things, saying things, we do things. The speech, therefore, does not only describe a situation, but in and by making claims, it also creates a situation. By saying something, we accomplish something. We have brought something into being. For this reason, I have come to the conclusion that rather than speech acts, I think we need to think about speech that acts. It gives the emphasis on what Austin, in my view, developed as a critique. And so it's not a question of speech acts, but speech that acts that is of issue here. And from meaning to force we move. Of saying something, if of saying something has meaning, a locutionary act, he called it, in or by saying something has force, illocutionary and perlocutionary acts, he called them. Now, that was an overview of Austin. I hope that I have indicated, highlighted the significance that impact it had on me, particularly understanding the difference between speech that acts and speech acts, and the difference between description, meaning, and utterance, and the difference between um, 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 a performative and a description. These are really different things. By accomplishing acts through utterances, we actually make speech act. How do we move on to digital acts? Does it work differently? I'm going to have to do a little bit more Austin for us to be able to enter into this. And then I'm going to look at the issue of digital acts. Let's zoom into this complex diagram that we have produced for Being Digital Citizens book, but we never published it. First, go through Austin, what he says. Austin himself classified speech acts as judgments, decisions, commitments, gestures, and clarifications. As I mentioned, he does develop a very complex schema through which various actions are understood as speech acts. But we also felt that a sixth possible classification that Austin never introduced and claims. It is one thing to think about speech acts as judgments, decisions, commitments, gestures, and clarifications, but it is another, which is particularly my interest, to understand people in the process of performing, making rights claims. I, we, they have a right to. What kind of speech is that? we categorize that as claims. And now moving into the digital sphere, understanding how these claims operate, we have introduced a number of distinctions. It would take too much time for me to enter all different platforms on the internet and their conventions and different actions that they introduce. And we haven't published this diagram, so you don't have access to it. Probably it will be published as part of this slide show. You can have a more detailed look at it. But number of distinctions that we have introduced are important to remember. First and most significant is the difference between closed and open platforms. Now, platform is a medium through which acting through speech is made possible on the internet. These platforms, most of them are closed platforms that impose particular conventions and governable conventions on users, those who are speakers on this platform. And these conventions are often in control of monopolies. So even when you think about Twitter and whether Twitter should ban a particular speaker or not, is considered whether a monopoly should have a right to ban without authorization from any state, any governing authority, except as a corporation. It is extraordinary that we have that debate and yet we don't stop to think what is happening in terms of the possibility of speech through these platforms. How these monopolies, which we call data empires, have extracted and exploited the situation in a way that created monopolies on these conventions. Now they're governing what can and cannot be said and who can and cannot say certain things. This is extraordinary and it has to be marked as either data empires or closed platforms. By contrast, there are also open platforms that do not attempt to either accumulate data over subjects and their activities, nor does it want to or need to control via conventions what they can say, what they cannot say. The internet has become increasingly dominated by closed platforms, and we have been captured as subjects on the internet in our possibilities and potentialities for speech. But luckily, there has been a strong pushback for this and strong creative data and platform activism that we also have open platforms that enable us to set the terms and conditions under which we want to speech to perform speech acts and their consequences. This is a significant development. We cannot really begin to talk about digital acts and how people are producing themselves as political subjects without understanding these fundamental aspects of performativity on the internet. And this is what we try to do. Now, this is the question that it raises. How are people making rights claims by disrupting corporate, governmental, and military organizations in and by acting through the internet? That becomes really the practical, theoretical, and empirical question that so far what I have said articulates. This is important. Number of propositions that go with this. I have already mentioned them. I'm not going to repeat them. There are acts of opening, acts of closing, certain conventions. There are legal, performative, and imaginary forces that make political subjects possible through digital acts. And the tension, there is a tension between performative force of producing conditions for digital citizenship. But essentially, one of the significant propositions is making digital rights claims by saying and doing I, we, or they have a right to, is effectively producing digital citizens as collective political subjects on the internet. How do we study them? That is the issue that I want to know. How do we study them? Whether these are migrants, refugees, citizens, non-citizens, we have to in some ways leave that categories behind, invent new categories with which to think, perform, and come back to those categories. So this is not a question of denying certain categories and their significance and um, injunctions such as we ought not to use migrants because they're like seeing like the state, or the refugees, that's because seeing like the state. It is not that kind of injunction. It's not that kind of act that I'm performing here. But we need to think differently before we think alike. Think differently about the ways in which we want to capture objects that don't necessarily present themselves as given to us, and understand how we might develop ways of understanding movement on the internet and the digital citizens that are constituting themselves as political subjects. Transversal movements is the concept with which I enter into transversal, in the sense that not just simply mobile and in mobility on the move, but transversal in the sense that it passes through various categories and ways of being. It passes through various jurisdictions, passes through borders and orders. It passes through identities, intersectionalities. This passing through and moving through are the aspect that I try to capture with the notion of transversal. And therefore, displacements, replacements, movements can be captured in their dynamism as transversality. That is, moving through, passing through variously constituted fixed things, ways of being, ways of acting, ways of understanding, ways of categorizing, ways of being legal, ways of being political. There are different ways that are being fixed by various forces, but transversal movements pass through them, therefore, give the glimpse of being different, performing politics differently. Um, for us to do that, ontology of the internet has to be thought differently. This is not going to be unfamiliar to many people who have written about cyberspace in very sophisticated ways, but it is worth mentioning that ontology of the internet, when we understand it as a totality rather than plurality and multiplicity, when we understand it as an ontological difference between offline and online, as though we are able to act online that has no reference or passing through, traversing through offline, or vice versa, as though we can act in the world, be in the world as an active subjects offline in this world in material ways that is not going to pass through online world. These assumptions are not manageable, are not um, persuasive. They cannot, I cannot hold these assumptions. And finally, as though an individual can be an individual on the internet, an entirely unique entity, that it doesn't pass through other individuals, doesn't intersect with other ways of being. There is no single individual on the internet. It is all collective subjectivities performed through what might one call individuation or ways of individuation. So ontology of the internet, the way it is structured, um, and then the ways in which I mentioned the conventions are organized, platforms are assembled, has to be understood differently. Now, going back to transversal movements, they take two forms. This is important to understand in cyberspace, on the internet, through digital hacks. One of them is about, we could say, mainstream, it's not, conventional ways in which aligning particular rights that we already have with rights that we want to have, and inserting these as digital rights claims in or by what we say in bills, charters, declarations, and manifestos. And there have been many. These are really significant speech acts on the internet because they articulate certain visions: closed versus open, progressive versus regressive, radical versus conservative, racist versus non-racist. These are really significant elements of inscribing certain images, imaginaries on the internet, and using them as ways of performing ourselves so that we can bring about a different way of being on the internet. These are what we call inscriptions. We try to inscribe with words certain values and principles that are emerging by the fact that we are doing politics on the internet into laws, enactment, laws, acts, and so on, and the principles. Now, the second type of politics of transversal movements, what happens is that it is not only inscriptions and declarations and manifestos and charters that are in principle doing the work, but actually um, specific practices, acts that bring about enactments of different ways of being on the internet. Um, Open source sharing, reassembling, regathering, um, reconstituting, creating new arrangements, opening up spaces, creating encryption so that people can say without being tracked, hacking. There's so many examples of actual acts on the internet that can no longer be considered as online or offline, but bringing about material differences, material practical differences into the world. These are transversal movements. Now, I can go on and give you some examples from critical migration studies, critical border studies, and critical digital and media studies. There are many of them. I'm not going to spend much time. I'm indebted to these studies, especially in the last 5 years, making us think differently about what happens in paradoxical situations where, on the one hand, refugees, non-citizens, migrants with various categories are interpolated into certain forms, and how criticism and counter movements open up new spaces. Myria, Georgiou's work, whether in terms of looking at communication infrastructure and speech on the net, or the creation of different visual grammars interpolating European citizens to see refugees as incompatible strangers, or Martina Tazzioli's work on migration movements, how they're being traced and tracked on the one hand, but how acts of subversion by migrants evade and deceive these tracking and tracing systems. Or Koen Leurs' work on how young refugees become digital storytellers about themselves and their conditions through specific platforms in solidarity with them, created to enable them to do so. Or Ludek Stavinoha's documentation of communicative acts of citizenship performed by refugees at Europe's borders. These are really significant studies that are shaping our knowledge of what I call transversal movements in the world. These transversal movements they challenge the systems and technologies that are being developed to track, troll, visualize, control, discipline, and surveil acts and actions. But their attempts to perform acts of opening also involves acting against injustice, oppression, repression, domination, and acts of closing are opened up, pried open, contested with these acts. These are tensions. These are tensions on the internet within transversal movements, how we actually manage to make rights claims and maintain criticality and radicality of these movements. One example I want to work through is actually a platform that I have rather closely looked at, impressed by, and really interesting possibilities, and how it also evolved in time. This is Ushahidi. By the way, in Shawili language, it means to witness, being a shahid, being witness or testimony. Testimony of something. That means creating an open platform to enable to make rights claims as testimony or witnessing oppression. I'm going to show some examples of how it works, and how significant it is in terms of understanding some of the complexities and um, tensions that emerge with this. Now, I mentioned that it's witnessing and testimony, and the way in which itself presents itself is where everyone is empowered to participate in creating a better world. What it does, it creates a platform. Unlike closed platforms, here's an example from Bolivia's solidarity movement during the pandemic. It creates a platform that connects people materially but virtually, and it allows, in this case, pool their resources, become aware of each other movements, proximity and distance from one another, and participate in pooling certain resources and disseminate and distribute those resources. Ushahidi also a brilliant platform in the sense that it is, of course, open, or at least it's partially open, but it allows also fairly simple technologies to participate in it. A mobile phone that is not a smartphone, does not have a GPS, does not have any of the smartphone capabilities, only capable of sending an SMS, can be incorporated into crowdsourcing of the needs, necessities, resources, and sources, and matching them in real time and in an ongoing basis. It is impressive in that sense. Now, it is also impressive that it was launched as a platform in Kenya in 2008 by several activists to map and report instances of electoral turmoil and violence. Over the last decade, it evolved into a transversal movement in providing an open platform for any group that wants to organize itself for uh, certain purposes against injustice, against oppression, share and pool various resources. In that sense, it is also very impressive. But as number of scholars, beginning with Miran Gutierrez, as well as Payal Aurora, Lindsay Palmer, and Philip Tigo. Also, a number of issues have been raised about this platform that really are important to put into perspective. What these critical scholars have begun to notice that Ushahidi itself increasingly becoming incorporated into closed platforms. That's why I earlier hesitated to call it entirely an open platform, and I called it partially open platform, because there are doubts about its incorporation. For example, it has entered into some partnership with Google, and also other corporations and sponsorships have appeared over time. And there are issues that are raised about to what extent privacy and anonymity are absolutely maintained. There are some issues about um, movement of data, as it is a transversal movement itself, and to what extent there are also selectivity in terms of being able to have access to um, this platform and its possibilities. It calls now itself as a social enterprise. It is not for profit as such, it's a social enterprise, but at the same time, it has to generate revenue from what it does to be able to maintain platforms' sustainability, and as well as interoperability, and enabling these techniques for transversal movements to organize itself, at the same time maintaining itself as a transversal movement. Number of issues that emerge from this platform are important to study transversal movements with. For example, the tension between closeness and openness, incorporation, commitment to social change, and certain radicalism of social movements, being transversal about borders and legal orders that are imposed on us, and to what extent this platform is able to also avoid, if not evade, the intense interest of corporate and state bureaucracies. These issues do indeed come up in the context of these platforms. And yet, at the same time, the platform itself is definitely a significant contribution to the way in which we want to understand transversal movements in the digital sphere. Now, to what extent we can consider these movements in relation to digital citizens yet to come? I'm going to now conclude my presentation with some remarks. I'm going to pose them as questions because these are really still questions to me. So I'm going to share with you as questions, although I have tentative answers to them. One of them is, it is in these transversal movements, various political subject positions have come about. How can we show that these political subjects in transversal movements, guerrilla engineers, guerrilla coders, feminist masqueraders, cyborg activists, video surveillance hacktivists, are these citizens, let alone digital citizens? In which sense I'm going to performatively signify them as citizens, and why? That is one question that is significant. Second one, how can we show that acts through which these subjects, these political subjects, transversal movements, I'm calling them as political subjects, make rights claims through the internet, through hacking, mapping, reporting, witnessing, commenting, monitoring, sensing? In which sense they're digital acts? Given what I said about the ontology of the internet and impossibility of making a break between online and offline activism and acts, to what extent we can consider these digital acts? For example, Ushahidi, it is uniquely digital, and it does make possible as a platform certain acts as a convention, and it is by far much more preferable than something like a closed platform like Facebook or Twitter. But to what extent we're going to interpret that which it makes possible as digital acts? And finally, the third major question is, how can we argue that the rights claims being made by these political subjects are producing rights that are rights of citizens? If citizenship is understood performatively, something that is to come, then in what sense these claims are citizenship claims when there is no matching right, legal right, to actually act or speak in the way in which we, the citizens, act? These are really difficult questions. It would take probably more than concluding remarks to very tough questions that I ended up asking myself about my own presentation and thinking through its consequences. But two things I'm going to make more like an appeal rather than an answer to these questions. An appeal of the way in which we ought to orient ourselves and think about these questions. One, the growing body of literature, of which I gave you some examples, on digital and data activism. The figure of the citizens remains an ambiguous figure. It is either not used at all, or if used, signifies an underspecified subject of rights whose legitimacy and authority remain uncertain. Because digital acts are transversal in the way in which I describe, to me, it is really crucial to consider which legal orders they challenge, which performative forces they generate, and which imaginaries they mobilize before we name the collective subjects that these acts produce. So my appeal to you is that although I call these political subjects as digital citizens yet to come, it is not necessarily that I have myself invested myself calling it that way. I am making an appeal for empirical and theoretical studies to demonstrate, as I say, conditions under which they challenge legal orders and which performative forces they generate and the imaginaries that they mobilize. So it is a call to name these subjects as digital citizens yet to come, but it is a conditional call on further research, further theoretical reflections. The second point I want to make, and an appeal, is the call for a digital citizen yet to come to maintain that making rights claims signify openings rather than closing is an important principle. If you like, a value, one which is invested. That citizenship is a political subjectivity, and expresses being with others means that it involves and provokes the cultivation of openness against closing. This is meta-theoretical, meta-political value, if you like. It's the revaluation of political values that brings us to the point. So it is, um, as much as it is performative, also it is normative investment. That openness of platforms and conventions brings about significant possibilities and potentialities than closing. And closing acts involve, for example, racism, misogyny, um, discrimination, um, homophobia, Islamophobia, these kinds of things that try to bring collectivities into closure, and not only closing in platforms but also closing in on themselves, and they have some, and making us believe that we have something to protect, we have something to differentiate ourselves from because uh, we are superior to those whom we understand as our others, are closings that we do not invest in performative understanding of politics. And it's not any different in digital acts and understanding also transversal movements. Transversal movements are inherently are invested in opening up possibilities and potentialities. Thanks very much for your potentiality as well as patience.